Ori and the Will of the Wisps is the sequel to the critically acclaimed Ori and the Blind Forest. Looking at the reviews for the Will of the Wisps, it's clear that it was received well, and in this video I'll be going over some reasons as to why I believe the game not only works as a good game by itself, but also what the game teaches about keeping the soul of the series while not being afraid of putting in new features that may or may not have been seen in other games. While looking at Will of the Wisps as a sequel, there was no way I could ignore the many comparisons that were made to Hollow Knight. Because of this, I'd like to give everybody a warning that I'm going to freely spoil big moments in both Ori games as well as some small stuff in regards to progression in Hollow Knight. So if you feel like you'd rather not be spoiled, get away quickly, play the games and maybe come back later. It's also important to know that I'll be looking at the original version of Ori and the Blind Forest, rather than the definitive edition. So if you feel like I missed something obvious, then that's hopefully why, although my incompetence could always play a role. With every game series, there are some parts that end up becoming a core part of the experience. Basically, these would be the parts that if they'd end up being taken away, would end up getting heavy backlash on your social media of choice. In this initial part of the video, I'll be going through the elements that make an Ori game. This will be done by making comparisons between the games, and in the case of something being brought over from the first to the second game, there could be an argument made for that being a part of the core Ori experience. Core Ori. Corey. Front and center for a Ori experience is of course the mystical world and visual style. The visuals very much speak for themselves, and I don't think I'd be capable of criticizing it in any way, as they both look good and are a big part of building up the mysticism of the world. Making the entire world feel magical and alien, while at the same time managing to make sense by having clearly defined rules that allow us to traverse the world confidently is no small feat. Of course, that understanding can to some degree be attributed to the short explanations you get when acquiring new skills, which leads me to the next pillar. Exploration. As far as I view it, there are two layers of exploration within Ori games. The first one being the exploration that's there for you to find some secrets, with the constants between titles being health and energy upgrades. These secrets are completely skippable and are there as a reason to revisit areas with new skills. The second layer are the skills. Being a part of the main progression path doesn't sound like it has much to do with exploration, but it's very much tied into how it's presented. To highlight this, I'd like you to imagine how it feels to move through a level in Devil May Cry. You're more than likely having a lot of fun, but unless you go out of your way to find secrets, you probably don't feel like you're exploring the world. On the other hand, in the Uncharted series, you oftentimes might find yourself thinking you're being an explorer when you're really just following similar hallways as you did in Devil May Cry. Ori does a similar thing, where it manages to make you feel like you stumbled onto something while in reality you were funneled into it so you could progress with the new abilities you obtained. This layer of fake exploration not only puts you into the mood of wanting to explore since you're obviously so good at it, but it also feeds directly into the first layer we discussed. With a lot of the abilities in the Will of the Wisps being highly contextual, you oftentimes know exactly where to apply your newfound skills. You remember that place that had a wall of sand blocking access to something that looked suspicious. And now that you've gotten the ability to dig through sand, it works as a great reminder that you can now get across. But it's not only backtracking that's kept relatively straightforward. The general progression through the game is clear as day. Either you're being funneled down a set path or you get a marker on your map telling you where to go. How the games handle failure states makes me believe that one of the key things that Moon Studios wanted to achieve is a game that can be described as challenging but not punishing. You see, whenever you die in Ori and the Blind Forest, you are brought back to where you last saved. And where you last saved can be pretty much anywhere there is solid ground. This means you can control how punishing your deaths will be because you're in control of setting your own checkpoints. In Will of the Wisps though, these checkpoints are set automatically, but rather than being a save point, it's handled as a save state from the last time you were on safe ground. The fact that you can get right back into the challenge at hand, as well as the resets being very quick, allows the developers to put in some difficult sections that test your skills while at the same time not punish you for being unable to do it. Having heavy consequences for your mistakes can make things more exciting, but it also runs the risk of players getting frustrated to the point where they turn off the game and never finish it. In the same way that Moon Studios quickly reset you after a death, they don't want you walking around the same areas for too long, and a way to make sure you don't get stuck is to clearly tell you where you're supposed to go. This puts the focus on getting there rather than a question existing of where to get. And while exploration when combined with progression can be seen as a great part of a game, I wouldn't be surprised that games that have unclear progression paths end up having fewer players seeing the ending. The idea that one is always better than the other for all people is absurd, although I do find myself strongly in the camp of enjoying progression intertwined with exploration. I have to respect that Moon Studios have decided to structure their game in a less punishing way while also making sure that it's not a walk in the park. A good example of this are the big set-piece moments that can be found in both games. Some of these sections can be surprisingly difficult while serving as a test on what you've learned throughout the area. In other cases, you might be able to clear them on your first try, but in both cases you are left with a memorable moment simply by the virtue of the spectacle. It's a solid way of making sure the players have something to latch onto whenever Ori is mentioned, and it's definitely a Ori experience. After all, it's in these sections where a lot of the stuff that's unique to the series is highlighted, with one of the main aspects being the bash ability. Overall, the movement in Ori is pretty standard, with jumps, dashes, wall jumps, and floats being available, but without the bash, there really isn't an Ori game. The amount of effort that has been put into making this feel good is very impressive, with the slowdown that happens, the rapid acceleration upon the release, and the visual and sound effects playing a big role in making it feel impactful. And it's been well worth the time investment, as the game would otherwise feel a lot more generic in its movement, while also restricting the options that the game's levels can make use of, as well as making the enemies more roadblocks than a tool to play around with. Speaking of enemies, the main villains of the games are always presented in a certain way. They aren't there to serve as some mustache-twirling bad guy that Ori can showcase its heroism on, but rather they are a way to tell traumatic stories of how people can become jaded by prior experiences, and how difficult it can be to break out of being the bad guy once you've been set on that path. I wouldn't be surprised if empathy is the main feeling they want the players to feel as they are exposed to these villains. But having said so, I don't think I'm very good at discussing character stories, but when something is clear enough for me to understand, I'd imagine they are hammering it in pretty hard. All of the aspects I've mentioned are what I'd consider vital for the Ori experience. But being a channel that mostly focuses on how games are designed, the aspects that stand out in that area are the following. The bash ability. Challenging but not punishing gameplay. Exploration for upgrades, and the visual spectacle moments. But these are only the things that are present in both games. The people who have played Will of the Wisps know that the game has much more to offer. So in the next section, I'm going to be focusing on how Will of the Wisps not only managed to make good use of its legacy from the Blind Forest, but also managed to introduce plenty of new aspects that will more than likely become a part of the core experience if the series continues or is given a spiritual successor. The earliest design element that the player sees significant change to is the combat. In Ori and the Blind Forest, your main way of dealing damage is to spam the button which sends out a projectile if Ori is within range. The movement of the player is completely unaffected by this, which incentivizes a safe playstyle where you always try to stay far away from the enemies unless you go out of your way to deal damage with your other abilities. But in Will of the Wisps, your first unlocked ability is a Sword of Light, which comes with attack animations and directional inputs to angle your slashes. At this point, some of you might think that I'm going to make a reference to a certain other game, but it's just going to take a little bit longer as there are some other features added that I want to touch upon first. Shards, are a way of enhancing different aspects of Ori. You can think of them as passive abilities that you set on your character in order to focus the character on the aspects that you find most important. All of these changes allows the game to dip its toes into the boss fight pool. Where the Blind Forest would use platforming to create a boss fight feeling, Will of the Wisps goes full on with attack patterns, health bars, and pretty much everything you'd come to expect from a boss. While the fights themselves being new, the base setup for them has been seen before, namely in the way the game handles its failure state. Just like the escape sequences from the Blind Forest, the fight resets instantly upon death without the music cutting out, which makes the whole thing blend together rather than focus being put on your failure. But combat isn't the only place where the world of Ori changed between titles. The biggest non-combat change probably being the inclusion of NPCs. Outside of it being nice to have some creatures in the world that aren't out to kill you, the NPCs also come with some side quests, and although some of those side quests may end up a little short of where they could have ended, others go a long way in giving you the satisfaction you're probably looking for. Making the Glades a really nice place to be ended up becoming a main driving point of what I wanted to achieve before finishing the game. Now at this point it's about time that Hollow Knight gets brought up again, as it's clear as day that there was a lot of inspiration gained from the title. One of the first points of course being with how the main weapon acts. Both the nail from Hollow Knight and the spirit edge from Ori are sword-like weapons that swing in a wide area where you're pointing. At a glance of course it sounds similar, but when all the aspects are taken into account, there's a different picture painted. Hollow Knight is more freeform in how the nail is used. No matter what direction you're swinging in, the speed of the nail stays the same. Ori contrasts that with the up and down swings being a lot slower than the sideways slashes. Hollow Knight also makes use of heavy knockback on the player character upon hitting anything. At first this can be jarring, but as you play the game more, it not only becomes second nature, but it also introduces the fact that you can use anything you hit from above as a bounce pad. Ori doesn't make use of this. Rather than having each swing be somewhat of a big deal, the swings in Ori blend into one smooth combo. This of course being if you manage to position yourself next to your enemies. With these changes, the base combat in Ori manages to not only feel very different from Hollow Knight, but actually having a very different focus. Rather than being a pixel-precise endeavor of getting hits in and maneuvering around your enemies, it's a visual spectacle that requires more of the player than what the Blind Forest did. While the charm and shards are very similar, there are some core differences which some people might not be aware of. Where Ori and the Will of the Wisps displays the full information about any given shard, Hollow Knight hides possible combos where different charms can work together to create a better effect than each charm would have on its own. There's also the fact that you can over-charm yourself. By over-charming, you are able to equip more charms than you have slots, but it comes with the effect of taking double damage from everything. Ori on the other hand doesn't allow this, while also having a more straightforward approach of each shard taking one slot rather than the varying amounts found in Hollow Knight. And there's the NPCs as well as side quests. Much like with the other aspects in the games, Hollow Knight has a tendency to allow the player to not understand what's going on, and sometimes maybe not even realizing that a side quest has been initiated. Ori on the other hand highlights each side quest in a log that's easily accessible and oftentimes has a waypoint that tells you where to go next in order to move forward with the side quests. I've made all of these comparisons in order to highlight how different seemingly similar features can be given some amount of tweaking. None of the features were copied over from Hollow Knight as a cheap way of taking something that worked for a competitor, but rather it was done from a place of understanding that the Blind Forest wasn't a perfect game and could stand to get some changes. While accepting that changes were needed and being humble enough to look at its competitors to see what they did so well, Moon Studios were careful to make sure that any feature added would fit into the Ori experience. In a lot of these, we can see that the challenging but not punishing mantra shines through. From the way that you can't lock out side quests because of something that you might need hindsight to understand, to the way that the combat is still somewhat simple while providing way more options this time around. There was careful consideration into making sure that no matter what was added, there would still be an Ori game for the people that fell for the Blind Forest. To summarize, I believe Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a great example of a developer having a good understanding of what the soul of the game is supposed to be, while also showing a great deal of maturity in accepting that they can learn from other developers and being dedicated enough to make sure to apply their own way of thinking on anything that makes it into the game. All of this is to say that I think it's a great game, but what stood out to me having played through the Blind Forest, the Will of the Wisps, and Hollow Knight within a 2-week window is how it's a great example of how a sequel can take what came before it and making it reach new heights. Writing this part of the script made me really excited about Silksong, and I hope that Team Cherry manages to treat Silksong with the same love and care that Moon Studios showed Will of the Wisps. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, you might want to consider subscribing to the channel or liking the video. If you didn't like it, then I'd like to encourage you to leave a comment if you feel like it's something that might make future videos from me more enjoyable. If you want to discuss the topic, I'd be happy to hear from you. Maybe leave a comment about a sequel that did a good job in respecting what made the predecessor great while also improving on it. If you feel like it, you can follow me on Twitter as well, @budding_basil. Thank you. Have a great day.